And we're on the air. All right.
Hey,
How's it going,
all
Jim?
right. Good. How are you, Paul?
Pretty good.
I'm getting my The Wire episodes in. I'm enjoying it. This is our discussion about The Wire Season 1, Episode 2, titled The Detail. And we'll talk, kind of continue our discussion that we had about the last episode, Episode 1. One of the things that immediately struck me, and so I'll just jump right in. And just as a heads up disclaimer for anyone watching this for the first time, this is not a summary of the episodes. We highly recommend you go watch the episode and think about this as kind of our commentary in relationship to the online storytelling class we're teaching, DS106, where nicknamed this semester Wire 106, because Wire will be the theme and kind of almost the lens through which we examine storytelling for this semester. So anyway, as I was saying, one of the things that strikes you again, and it shows you, we talked about surveillance in season 1, right? And there's
Yeah.
6 or 7 examples. And we even just focused on the one with the FBI, where they were looking at these guys, counting money and, obviously maybe cutting drugs. Who knows? I
Yeah.
can't see that clearly. But this season starts, or the episode 2 starts, at least not maybe the first shot, but I think the first shot is actually of the body in the morgue, which is a
Yeah.
very compelling shot. We could talk about that one, and I think you blogged about it already.
Yeah.
That's a powerful shot, but the shot after the credit sequence is a surveillance shot again. And there were 6 of them in the first episode, and episode 2, in keeping with episode 1, has more surveillance. So, just so it's clear what we're talking about, here's a quick look at that surveillance shot as Daniels and his detail are going down to check out their digs, which are quite attractive, right? In the basement. So there they are. And then there they go into the halls of justice. And one quick note about that, one quick note about that is how realistic that video is as they're coming through, right? There's no cinematic effect to that. It just looks like you're really looking at a video screen. The idea of realism in documentary that you were talking about in the last episode, it shows up right away and then cuts to the cinema and the color. And it's kind of a really it's you're jolted out of the surveillance to the story. And it's interesting how in the very fabric of the episode, they're making you, both not only a watcher, but you're also playing the role of a surveyor, right? And you're kind of almost, in this position of power over these characters in this weird way. It's a compelling moment for me.
Yeah. Yeah. You got that looking down on them from, your bird's eye view, seeing what's going on. Um, and you do see those surveillance shots throughout the whole thing. The nice thing about that scene is you see that hallway was like marble and gold. Um, and from there, if you have the rest of that scene, they go down into the basement.
Yes. And
Um, yeah, and that it says something about their status within the department, how much the police want this investigation to happen.
yeah, like they're truly burying it, right? Like,
Yeah,
I mean, like literally burying it.
they're sending these guys down into the dungeon. It's
Yeah.
punishment.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, it truly is. And the interesting part too is there's a lot of play on that comically in this episode, right? There's the moment where the guys are hitting on the piping and they're like, "Hey, what? Hey, what? Don't touch that." And they're trying to give their debriefing, and there's a real great comic moment there, but there's this also underlining sense of within the bowels of the institution, right? Like you really get
Yeah.
that almost literally, like the bowels of the whale to go with that Moby Dick, right? We talked about in around the first episode. You're really in the bowels of the police department, and you can feel it.
Yeah. Yeah.
I wonder if, I mean, I don't want to cut you off, but we talked about parallels in the last episode, and
Yeah.
they're also in this episode. So we got certain themes recurring, right?
Yeah.
And if one of them is the bowel, I mean, one of them is the relationship between say the gangs and the police department. Another one is just kind of gags that are paralleled and what they might mean, right? And this happens a lot in episode 2, where we kind of start digging into what might be behind some of Simon's vision for this. And so I'm going to show a quick scene, and we could talk about it as we see fit. But this is a quick example of that gag between the judge and McNulty, and then in those bowels. So let's just take a quick look, because it's probably easier to show it than to talk about it. So here we are.
I didn't think you would have straight up hang me out on the line in the shitstorm.
But it's not like it was when I was a prosecutor. I'm a judge now. The rules are different.
You missed the spot.
Yeah, well, what's done is done. Question is, what do you want me to do now? Hey, you missed the spot. Why don't you fucking do it? She...
Yeah, so I love that scene, and we talked about it before, but I mean, looking at it again, there's the parallel, and those scenes really do follow one another. I cut them down just for brevity, but they follow one another, and you know, this idea of you missed the spot, and obviously what that alluding to beyond those particular scenes, but also the way of cutting between them. And as soon as that guy's saying seniority, you see Jimmy come in, right? You see Jimmy come in to kind of link the two. But what do you make of that?
I'm not sure. I mean, you know, that using that exact same line, and we've seen that before. Like, you know, in the last episode, we talked about Rawls and McNulty and Avon and D'Angelo, and both of those conversations start with "sit your ass down." You know,
yeah, right.
And it's the same thing here. You know, you missed a spot, so it's intentional. I'm not really sure how to interpret what it means.
Well, I wonder if it also, one of the ways I read it is, it's starting to show the viewer how to watch it. Like, these are parallels. Not only did that happen in the first episode, but it's happening in the second, and they actually start linking back, right? Like, you start realizing that there's not only a structure, but it's not your formulaic structure. It's a literary structure, and it's linking between scenes. And I think as we move beyond, you'll start thinking probably what linked in one scene can link back to an episode in another season, or a kind of 4 or 5 episodes earlier. Like, I think it's starting in very small ways immediately to start let the kind of audience and train the audience to think about this series in terms of literature, in terms of literary references, and in terms of parallels of thinking and of themes that aren't limited to this idea of time to, you know, pump this out so we get to the formula at the end and then go to the next one and just kind of really churn and burn. You know, this is about kind of, I think, like any good video game or any good story, training your reader or training your watcher how to watch, how to view, how to kind of be brought in. And it's a really interesting thing about storytelling is, you know, and it would be a great assignment, I think, is how do you train your viewer, your watcher, your listener to understand what you're trying to do without being pedantic? You know, it's a fascinating kind of idea of storytelling.
Yeah, because in that scene they're very close together, and it's really a very obvious, you know, repetition. I know later in the series, well, later seasons, there's some really powerful parallels that run that same thing, but they're farther apart. They're a little more subtle.
That's right.
But much more significant.
That's right. I agree.
When we talk about...
Go ahead.
When we talk about the parallels, if this wants to come up for me.
Yeah, let's look at it.
There's a issue of symmetry.
Yeah.
That I brought up when I was blogging about it. And this is actually the opening shot of the episode. This is the man that we saw murdered at the end of the previous one. But you see that symmetry. He's like right in the middle. It's almost not perfect symmetry, but very close. And I was reading about, you know, symmetrical composition in a film magazine that, yeah, it's a very powerful, striking image, almost so much that you have to be careful how you use it. So not quite perfect symmetry, but it's there. Um, one of the reasons you want to stay away from it is because it starts to look forced, you know, where
Yeah.
it takes you away from that realism. Um, if you think of like The Shining, used a lot of symmetry in it, and that like heightened the unreality of what's going on here. So here, you have to kind of hold it close. But we've got that symmetrical thing right in the opening shot. It's a really powerful image. Um, and let me find the other one.
And it visually links you to what happened in the previous episode without doing like your quick montage about previously on The Wire, right? Like
Right,
it's just
yeah.
an iconic image that brings you in. And again, doesn't kind of, I mean, assumes that you have a brain, assumes that you have a memory, assumes that you've been watching closely. Like assumes a lot of things of the viewer that I think show great respect.
Yeah, and this is actually really dark, so you can't see it, but this is the closing shot of the first episode. Um, and it's showing the same kind of symmetry. You know,
Of the second
Daniel's
episode.
face, yeah, Daniel's face
Yeah.
right in the center of the screen. Um,
Yeah.
and that's, I
So
guess,
I
it's
like that.
also a different parallel or symmetry that it opens and closes
That's right.
kind of thing.
And really watching closely enough, like the kind of expectation that you'll watch closely enough to pick up on this stuff. And I think one of the things you realize, especially when watching the director's commentary, that none of this stuff is kind of unintentional. Like they kind of establish authorial intent. Like they were doing this to get this effect. And like they would probably not use that shot, like you said, and center it so kind of symmetrically because they're going for a very different style. They're going for a documentary style, but it doesn't mean that this isn't a work of fiction and they aren't trying to communicate different things visually. So they're really trying to do that. I mean, the same goes with the shot you showed in the last episode with the chicken and the burgers, right? Like they are creating, these are shots that are set up, that are imagined, and that are trying to communicate something beyond just these are the streets, the hard streets of Baltimore. I mean, it does that, but it does a lot
Yeah.
more.
Yeah, yeah. Well, actually, while we're on that point, let me bring up one more shot.
Absolutely.
Um, like I was saying before in the other episode we did, every picture tells a story. Um, this here, it's a shot of one of the detectives, Lester Freeman, working on. He makes a dollhouse furniture, you know, when he doesn't have better things to do.
Yeah.
Um, but he's looking through that magnifying glass, you know, carving this really minute detail into, you know, I don't know what it is, like a
It's like a desk, maybe.
maybe a desk, a drawer, or something, you know, but there's really ornate carving that he's doing under a microscope. Um, the whole attention to detail thing really says a lot about his character.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. I mean, and it's what Lester Freeman becomes an unbelievable character in the first and second series, and really throughout the show. And it does. You're right. Like it foreshadows very subtly who he's going to be and where his strengths are going to be as a character. And
yeah,
you come back and you start looking at that stuff, and right, and like think of an assignment. I think of assignments around the wire more and more now that we're starting to get into it. Like, what would it mean to make the Lester Freeman card? Like, what would be those visuals that would actually capture someone like him or McNulty or, Daniels or whoever you were talking about in that series? And I think it's really interesting the ways in which the visual rhetoric happening here is just as powerful. But sometimes it's lost within the very powerful and really brilliantly written textual, right? I mean, one of
right.
the things The Wire has, and which Simon is known for, I mean, he is a novelist, right? He writes, he's known for his show The Homicide, which is based on his book, and he's a writer first and foremost, and
Yeah,
his foray into television, showed a whole nother side of his skills and his ability to kind of, produce this stuff. But, he does, the writing captures you, and sometimes it's so powerful that you miss all the details happening in the universe. And I think that's one of the things that lulls you into. Uh, on that note, one of the things we might want to look at is how I think one of my favorite scenes, and it talks about David's I mean, Simon's writing in some powerful ways, is the way in which we go to the pit, and there's the three, what they call what do they call them? The Pit Boys? Do they call them that, actually? They don't call them the Pit Boys, but
Yeah.
something similar.
The crew in the pit.
Yeah, there's actually a particular name, and I'm forgetting it.
Yeah.
But anyway, there's the ones where they're on the couch, and that couch becomes a huge prop throughout season 1. And they're eating chicken McNuggets. And there's this whole story around the chicken McNuggets, like who invented them and how, whether they get reimbursed or whether they're rich or not. And it's just great. So let's watch that a bit. I was writing a little bit.
You came here from casualty section?
This is almost over. Yeah, here it is. Perfect. Oh, let me just not screw that up too much.
Good with the hot sauce too, though.
Most definitely.
Let me get. You want some of it?
Nah, go ahead.
Man, whoever this these, he off the hook. Why? Motherfucker got the bone all the way out the damn chicken. Till he came along, niggas been chewing on the drumstick.
Oh,
Shit, get their fingers all greasy. He said, leave the bone. Look at that meat up and make some real money.
Chicken man got paid.
Too.
Man won't get it.
Shit, you richer than a motherfucker.
Why? You think you get a percentage?
Why not?
Nigga, please. The man who invented them things, just some sad ass down at the basement of McDonald's. Thinking of some shit to make some money for the real place. Nah, man, that ain't right. Fuck right. It ain't about right. It's about money. Now, you think Ronald McDonald gonna go down that basement and say, hey, Mr. Nugget, you the bomb. We selling chicken faster than you can tear the bone out. So I'm gonna write my clowny ass name on this fat ass check for you. And the nigga who invented them things, still working in the basement for regular wage, thinking of some shit to make the fries taste better, some shit like that. Believe.
I mean, there's a couple of things happening in that scene, and it's just great writing, and the whole way he captures their intonation and colloquialisms, but the also notion of this referring back to the people in the basement. And that paralleling back to the cops who are working, and you'll realize as this series goes on, and the entire, from institution to institution, it is about these people laboring for the benefit of a few. It's what's happening in the projects, it's what's happening in the institutions, and there are some real limits to how much anyone's willing to share with anyone. I love this idea that clowny ass Ronald McDonald signing a check over to someone for doing something that's well deserved. I mean, it's such a brilliant way to get at some of the endemic, systematic problems with how we think about it. But yet, these two kind of drug dealers, I didn't have a name for it. I don't know why I'm missing the name. They completely believe, right? They completely believe in the American dream, like in episode 1, right, with Snot. Right, like the ability, like the American dream, this idea that there is some sort of reward system out there, still compels us.
Yeah, whereas the message of that story is basically, it doesn't pay to do a good job.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's just
I think that it sort of like ties into what's going on in season 2, or what's going on in the schools,
Yeah.
Even in City Hall,
Absolutely. I mean, and D'Angelo is great for this. I mean, D'Angelo is one of the great characters, right? And we'll see it again in a later episode. We'll talk about it with the whole chess scene. But, D'Angelo is one of those deep philosophical figures that kind of understands it and can communicate it in a way that no one else can. And, his weaknesses, as we see them by folks like Avon and Weebay, see him as weak, and the cops see him as weak in this episode, and they're able to take advantage of them. Like, everyone sees him as weak, but no one sees him as, the poet and philosopher that he is, which makes him one of those really, truly compelling characters of the series for moments like this. Just brilliant writing, brilliant characterization, and the two, Wallace and the other character, just play it brilliantly as well. It's just great writing.
Yeah.
So and so we can talk about the writing. The next scene that I'm compelled by, and I think for me in season 2 is one of the more powerful, And this isn't necessarily about the writing. This is about the situation. This is when Herc, Carver, and Presbolewski, the three kind of knucklehead cops, find themselves in the tower at 2 in the morning trying to kind of rough shit up, right? Like they're going to go in there and they're going to solve this case by pulling out their guns and playing cowboys. And what happens resulting is kind of horrific, right? So
Yeah.
they get in there, and let's just take a little of that scene. And let me share this with you. Here we go. You're going to hear some sound, and then you're going to see it.
I got nothing for you. Who are you gonna high fuck now? Serious? You got my card? You got my card. Get your shit off my card. Fucking up. Got a visual? Get the radio. 11:35. Signal 13. 771 Franklin. In the court. Shots fired. Shots fired. Officers in assistance. Okay. Signal 13. Officer down. Officer down.
And so that's the kind of, for me, I mean, that isn't the scene about necessarily the writing. It's the situation, right? And this kind of, it, like you said, it goes into this documentary mode, right? You get the camera, it's frenetic, it's close up on them, they're looking up, you don't know where it's coming from, the stuff starts cracking. Presbolewski, I don't know if that came through, it might have been choppy, but it knocks him in the eye, cuts open his eye, and then the towers, right? They start coming to life. And you feel the sense of the war, right? You feel the sense of the deep tension between the cops and the residents of this tower. And they're harassing. It's brutal. It's brutality. And it's met with more force. And it's this unclear, uncomfortable moment in the episode where there is no clear right or wrong. And these cops are jackasses, at least in this instance. And it's just a very hard scene.
Yeah. And you talk about the towers, that's interesting because it seems like everything's coming from the buildings, you know. You don't see someone throwing these things. It's coming from the environment, from the city.
Yeah, that's right. And, you know, we talked about in the previous episode the city as character. And, I mean, this kind of really insistence upon space and place and the fact that this is all filmed in these particular parts of Baltimore and whether or not this was, I mean, I don't think, I listened to Clark Johnson, who was the director of this, talk about it, and I think this was kind of actually an old folks' home, he was saying, or something like that. But it was very much a place within the city that's reproducing an effect. And shooting this in the city, he said, when they did shoot it, was kind of uncomfortable because they were actually reproducing a scene that was very, you know, that in real space and time, that has a history, that these are these kind of confrontations on a regular basis. This isn't fiction in some ways. This is actually what plays out and is playing out right now in our own culture. I mean, and there's that's kind of notion of watching it unfold and then also watching the cops close ranks so quickly after it, right? Like when Daniels comes in and says, look, here's your story, and if you don't stick to it, I can't help you. But you have to. It really is not shying away from this kind of heroic or unheroic visualization of the police force and the brutality. But it doesn't, that's not all it is either, though. Right? Like there's also good police, right? And there's this whole idea of natural police. So it's really even balancing that.
Yeah. Yeah, that scene is really uncomfortable, you know, when you think about things that are going on just today, you know.
Yeah, exactly.
There's that whole confrontation there that didn't really actually have to happen, you know.
Yeah. It was completely, it was absolutely avoidable, which is very distressing. And it's interesting because, I mean, every episode has a kind of what would you call it, an epigraph, right?
Yeah.
Like it has basically like the quote that they pull out that, I don't know, kind of encapsulates the episode. But the next scene we'll watch is the epigraph that's said by Daniel's wife, right? Who seems to be a lawyer or some high political or high end business figure, and she basically talks about this idea of the game and playing the game, and you get a look at their apartment and their life, and it's interesting. So I'm going to put that scene on now, and then we can talk about that too. Look at it.
Even if they put a 14-year-old kid into critical care. This case is just... Get out of it. How do I do that? I don't know. But you can't lose if you don't play. I was certain that you can't win if you don't play. The department puts you in a case it doesn't want. You're giving people that are useless or untrustworthy. Correct. If you push too hard and any shit hits the fan, you'll be blamed for it. Correct. If you don't push hard enough and there's no arrest, you'll be blamed for that too. Correct. The game is rigged. But you cannot lose if you do not play.
Right, and that's yet another theme of The Wire, that the game is rigged. You see it again, and I think Simon says that, and you watch him on videos on YouTube, wherever. He always talks about that. The game is rigged, and it's really this kind of concept for him that, like, institutionally there are limits. And I don't know if the show's a hopeless show. Like, I don't think it's like abandon all hope. The game is rigged. But there's this kind of conscious kind of reinforcing and underlining and kind of constant focus on, how much these games we play are kind of framed by and focused by and reinforced by an institutional logic that has already tried to predetermine the outcome, right? With the statistics, with the murders we talked about in episode 1, like, and the kind of the data and all the points of, we want you to frame the story how it is before it's even told. And that rigging of it is what you see here. And it's great how brilliantly she lays it out.
Yeah, that idea of the game is interesting because it cuts across all strata, in the story. Because Omar is talking about the game, and his part of the game is to rob drug dealers. And the drug dealers talk about the game, and police talk about the game, and Daniel's wife is, a lawyer, politician. I'm not sure what her story is there. But they all see it. There's a game going on here.
Yeah, and, again, there's the game, and you even see from Daniel's is, you listen to the classical music, you hear the clinking of the silverware, right? And
fine crystal glasses and the wine and the pewter vase.
And there's another, again, with the design and the strata of culture, and even Daniel's situation, his relationship to wealth, as you mentioned earlier, is subject to question. And like, even the scenes in all the different, like you said, strata, but also all the different seasons, this notion of the game is, you can't really opt out of it, right? It's almost, the question is, how are you going to play it, right? And someone like D'Angelo can't play it because he's too close to it, right? But he also has a really brilliant view of it, right? So he can't play it, but he understands it in some deep ways. And, it's almost like every character, it's not about whether they're good or bad. It's not about, like, whether they're a drug dealer or a kind of deputy ops of the police force. It's what their positionality is within the game, through which you understand them. And it's as if Simon is sympathetic enough to understand that, and to give every character from which their positionality that they speak, right? And it's when that breaks down that it's no longer interesting, right? It's just good versus bad or right versus wrong. But at this
Yeah.
situation, everyone is kind of a node within the network of the city that frames the larger understanding of culture in our moment. It's just
Uh,
brilliant. And that goes back to that Balzacian notion of creating a universe with these characters. And the characters come into flux, and who's important at which time or not um, is far kind of more compelling than a formulaic episode that's going to take you through another solved, like, what you would get with Dexter, right? Like a new
yeah.
serial killer, a new formula, a new solution. And this is not that, right?
Right. Yeah. Um, and just as a contrast, we looked at Daniels at home. Here's a picture of McNulty at home.
Yeah.
Um, and
Yeah.
this shows up, I believe, a little bit before the Daniels scene, um, but there's nothing there. He's got a mattress sitting on the floor and a pile of clothes in the corner. Um, and that picture says a few things about him, right? Within the line of story, he's separated from his wife, and that's why he's living alone. But it also says, yeah, this guy has no life other than his job. There's nothing there. Um, and also compared to like Daniel's thing, like the wealth as opposed to the nothing that this guy has. Yeah.
Yeah, and the other thing that's interesting to me is Daniels in this episode says to, McNulty says to Daniels again and again in this episode, I want to know you're in. I want to know you're full in, right? And
Yeah.
McNulty's is full in, right? He's always full in. He's a psychotic. He's too full in, right? But Daniels is flirting with that, and then you might get a glimpse through his home life why he's not full in. He's trying to move his way up the ladder. He's got a certain amount of kind of wealth and freedom at home and a family, or at least a wife to come home to, and a kind of life beyond the police force. And part of him is trying to prevent himself from being sucked too deep into the game, to play it a little bit on the outside and move up. And it's constantly, and not judgmentally. Like, it's not like, okay, so Daniels is a bad character. He's playing the game. They're playing it differently for different reasons. And at certain points, these characters overlap and they find themselves on the same path for a little bit, and then they diverge, which is like life. And
Yeah.
you can't do that in a formulaic, system. You can only do it in a universe that you let unfold in some natural and powerful novelistic way. So, it's really just another example, even in the small bits we talked about how this show is something else.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right.
All right.
Well, without trying to go too long, maybe we'll stop that one there and we'll do episode 3 next.
Okay.
All right, Paul.
All right. Later.
Bye bye.